Well, earlier we were back here having breakfast with the speakers, and as we were sitting around the tables, it dawned on me that I was the only Presbyterian in the room. And I feel like a lion in a den full of Daniels. So I just want to say thank you for having me. We're grateful to partner. Not only do we have a decades-long partnership between really what are the two battlefield theologians of our generation, and God in his infinite wisdom put one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast, but a decades-long friendship between Drs. MacArthur and Sproul, and very grateful for that. And a continued partnership with the various outreaches of Grace and Ligonier. We're glad to have a booth back here with the other exhibitors. One of the things that we're doing at Ligonier is seeing ourselves more and more as a global outreach ministry, not as an English only or even English first outreach ministry. And to that end, hot off the press is this Arabic translation of Grace Alone. So they're back there, and some of the other things that we have in terms of our global resources that we want to make available to you all who are out there in the trenches on the front lines, that we give you resources that you can put in the hands of God's people. So we're grateful to be here, grateful for this time with you. My talk is entitled The Gospel in This Little Corner, ? Now, the question mark is important. It comes from Luther. It's a line from Luther. Not a line from a sermon or not a line from a treatise, but a line from what we have come to know as Luther's table talk. Table talk was just Luther sitting around the table, outmatched sometimes by his wife, Katie, but always joined by fellow faculty there at Wittenberg, passing through dignitaries, students, and of course his family, and the family dog also participated in this, and Luther references him from time to time. And in one of these moments, Luther was reflecting on the gospel witness that is there in Wittenberg. And then he makes this comment: what does it matter? What does it matter that we have the gospel in this little corner when there are so many places? And he actually begins to identify Eastern European people groups and even continents. What does it matter that we have the gospel in this little corner when there are so many peoples and so many places that do not have the gospel at all? And in that statement, you get a glimpse into not only Luther's heart and Luther's passion, but in what is really one of the untalked about, not talked about enough subjects of the Reformation, and that is the Reformers' passion for global mission. The Reformers' passion to see that, as the prophet says, that the knowledge of God is to spread across the earth as the waters cover the sea, that you see how central that passion was to their work. And so we begin with Luther. At Wittenberg, Luther trained not only German students, but students who came from across the continent to be trained there in the gospel and in Scripture, and then sent back into their places to be that gospel witness. There were a group of students, two students that came from the Netherlands. And they trained there at Wittenberg, and they were equipped and trained, and they were sent back to the Netherlands. And they were met at the border. They were questioned if they would in fact preach these Luther doctrines. And of course they said that that was absolutely their intention, to preach this gospel. And so they were arrested, and so they were martyred. The word of their martyrdom got back to Luther at Wittenberg, and Luther wrote what was to be his first hymn to commemorate the lives of these martyrs. It wasn't really a hymn. It was more accurate to call it a folk ballad. It had 21 stanzas, and it chronicled the lives of these monks. And Luther gave it this title, A New Song Shall Here Be Begun. It was a new song of gospel proclamation. It was a new song of a commitment to theological orthodoxy. Ultimately, it was a new song of calling the church to be the church as God called it and as God had given it its task. And these weren't the only students that Luther trained. Luther trained students who went into Finland. And when they got back to Finland, they immediately began on a Finnish translation of the Bible so that the Finns could have the Bible in their own language. There was his friend Bugenhagen. Dr. Pomeranius, Luther called him, because he was from Pomerania. And so his commitment to see that the Bible would be in the Polish language. And so we have this in Wittenberg ascending center. At one point, there were 20 different languages spoken by the students gathered at the University of Wittenberg in the 1540s, all being trained and all taking the gospel back with them. When we go down to Geneva, we see the same thing in Calvin's Geneva. First, it was a place where people came as refugees. Whether these were refugees from Italian cities where there was persecution, like the Florentine jewelers who came to Geneva, or whether it was from Great Britain and Scotland, and under Bloody Mary and the exiles that flocked to Geneva. There were many nationalities present, descending upon Geneva, and it was a rather limited city at the time. It, of course, had a wall. This is Old Geneva. There wasn't a lot of space to expand. If you wander the streets of Geneva today, you'll see these wonderful townhomes, but you'll notice something. They're 4 stories or 5 stories, and the 5th story or the 6th story, whatever it may be, that final story that was attached, just looks different than the other stories. And that was because these Genevans couldn't go out to absorb these refugees, so they simply took the roof off of their houses and went up. And so they just added a floor and stuck some Scottish people up there, or added a floor and stuck some Florentines up there. And so they became a place where those who were persecuted could come. But as Calvin often said, he worked in Geneva, but his heart was in France. And so Geneva was committed to supplying France with a network of pastors. It's estimated that some 2,000 churches, a network of underground churches, all of this in the 16th century, a network of some 2,000 churches were established in France by those who were trained at Geneva and also by those who were funded by the people of Geneva to take that gospel into that nation that was so dark, almost as if the Reformation could not penetrate into France as it had in places like England, in Luther's Germany, in Calvin's Geneva, in Zwingli's Zurich, here in this dark nation of France where Roman Catholicism had what appeared to be a stranglehold, a network of 2,000 churches. And then on top of that, in the 1550s, Geneva trained lay pastors that boarded a ship and went to Brazil. It landed in what was then the Guanabara Bay. We know it today as Rio de Janeiro. And when they landed there, fully welcomed by the Catholic officials that were attempting to colonize Brazil, when they landed, they were initially welcomed, and then they were very much unwelcomed, and they were kicked out of Brazil. 6 of them were put on a ship to be sent back to Switzerland. A little bit offshore, they decided that they were called to take the gospel there, and no matter what the cost, they would go back. So over the evening and the cover of night, They let a little dinghy down off the side of the ship and began a very dangerous trek to row back to the shores of the Guanabara Bay. One of them died on the voyage back. 5 of them landed. They were very quickly arrested and rounded up. They were ordered to write out their confession of faith. It was, in fact, the first confession of faith written in the Americas and was written in the Guanabara Bay. It's called the Guanabara Confession of Faith. It dates to the 1550s. It's not only before the Westminster Confession, it's even before the London Confession of Faith. And they wrote this confession out and they signed their name. All of them, all 5 of them. I won't give you their names because I will slaughter the French pronunciation. But they signed their names to that document, and that evening they were martyred for their faith. The reformers, even with the limitations of the 16th century, with travel and so forth, had a heart, a passion to see the gospel spread across the globe as the waters cover the seas. They ignited what was really 3 centuries of mission endeavors. We often don't see that as we think back on the reformers and their legacy, but we must see it. Of course, a lot of this mission work was carried on by that branch of the Reformation that found itself in Old England and then transported to New England. One of those persons in particular is John Eliot. John Eliot labored among the Algonquin peoples in New England, and he helped first codify their language. There, of course, was not a written language, so he needed first to get the grammar and get a vocabulary and get a written language. And then he labored to translate the New Testament into the Algonquin language and to have it printed. And he did all of this in 1663. It's the first Bible printed in America. Of course, this is the era of the king controlling the printing of the Bible. And there were designated printers who could print the Bible, and none of them were, of course, in New England. They were in Old England. So it was some time before an English Bible could be printed in the colonies. In fact, we needed a little revolution for that to happen. But the first Bible published in the United States is the Algonquin New Testament. In the 1660s, to help his efforts, John Eliot formed what was one of the earliest missionary societies, the Society for the Propagation of the Christian Knowledge in New England. That eventually was taken over by the Scottish and British benefactors and renamed the Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge. All of this was in the 1660s. The SPCK, which is today a publishing house, you might very well have some books in your library with that on the spine, SPCK. It was initially a mission organization. The Society for the Propagation, the Spreading, the Proclamation and the Spreading of Christian Knowledge. This in colonial New England. As we move into the 1700s in our sketches of missions from church history, we bump into another figure that we know as a theologian, we know as a pastor, we know as an author, but we don't know him as missionary. But he spent 7 years of his life as a missionary among Native Americans, mostly among Mohicans, but among other tribes as well, among the Native Americans. This, of course, is Jonathan Edwards. He was minister there at First Church in Northampton, always had an interest in missions throughout his pastoral ministry. This mission that was founded in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And to get your geography here, you've got Boston on the East Coast. You go into about the middle of Massachusetts. You've got Northampton right along the Connecticut River, which just runs right through the middle of the state and down on into Connecticut. And empties into the Atlantic Ocean. And about 40 miles to the west of that Connecticut River Valley is the outpost of Stockbridge, Massachusetts, and the Berkshire Mountains. There's a river there, the Housatonic River, and it carves out a plain right in those Berkshire Mountains. And right at Stockbridge, it created a beautiful, fertile plain. Right this day, this present day, it's, of course, a golf course. And what a great spot for a golf course. If only R.C. and MacArthur had golfed in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. But at the time, it was the absolute western frontier, Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And it was a missionary outpost. And Edwards, as a pastor, would try to raise money from his congregation to support the work at Stockbridge. And it was usually not as much money as Edwards would hope for. And so we see him giving his congregation a hard time, berating them that they don't take this task of missions seriously. In fact, at one point, Edwards wondered if the colonies were in fact colonized for the sole purpose of bringing the gospel to the heathen that were here and in their darkness needing the light of the gospel. Perhaps Edwards would wonder out loud, this is the whole reason we are here in the first place. Well, in his lifetime, the book that sold the most and the book of his that got the most attention was a biography. And it was a missionary biography. David Brainerd was endeared to Edwards the moment Edwards first heard about him. Brainerd, like Edwards, was a student at Yale. And Edwards, having been an alum of Yale, was concerned with what he had seen at Yale or heard about happening at Yale. It was the same thing that happened to his father's alma mater at Harvard, a slip away from the passion and the intention and the theological orthodoxy of its founders. And so Edwards was wondering what was happening at his beloved Yale, and he heard a great story of David Brainerd as a student there. And David Brainerd, and you can picture him, brash, idealistic, the very typical college student. This is why I love college ministry, to be around college students with their idealism and their feistiness. And Brainerd says to one of his professors at Yale University, "This chair, sir, has more of the Spirit of God than you do." And it was from that moment on that Edwards loved this guy, David Brainerd. Brainerd would find himself first, as obviously coming out of Yale that way, was not welcome into pulpits, that many pulpits. So he finds himself first at that outpost at Stockbridge, being trained to be a missionary among the Indians that were there. And then he heard about a group of Indians down in the Delaware River Valley, on the New Jersey side of the Delaware River and on the Pennsylvania side. And then he heard about another group of Indians that were in a river valley that was in the center of the state, the Susquehanna River. And so he heard about the Delawares and the Susquehannocks, these Native American tribes that were without a witness. And so Brainerd went. It was very unsuccessful as a missionary. He was not well received at all. I think he had a little bit of that brashness that was in him still from Yale, a little bit of perhaps too much zeal. But he wasn't well received among these Native Americans at first. And so he did what many of these Puritans did in those days. He kept a diary, a detailed diary, not so much all the details of his day or what the temperature was, but a diary that peered into the very corners and crevices of his soul, that revealed what he was thinking about God and how he was relating his task and his work and his ministry to what he was understanding God's calling upon his life, and was not always seeing alignment with those things. And so the diary was in many ways his working out of these soul struggles that he was experiencing as he was literally slogging it out there in the early days of his ministry. But as he persevered and proclaimed the gospel, God did bring blessing to David Brainerd, and he was able to establish churches and see a gospel witness established among these Delaware Indians. And then he felt very ill, a nagging cough, just a weakness and a fatigue, and he needed to leave and go coalesce. He was invited into Edwards' very home to be nursed back to health. And Edwards, who was a bit of a scientist in his early days as a student and always had an interest in the natural world and the sciences, kept a detailed account of David Brainerd's symptoms, and we now know that David Brainerd had tuberculosis. And so he was not able to be nursed back to health, but in fact died in Edwards' home. And Edwards had there Brainerd's diary, and he completed that diary using it as the germ to write a biography, The Life of David Brainerd. Talk about its impact in a moment, but one of its initial impacts was on Edwards himself. And so he began to see this need to proclaim the gospel to those who've never heard the gospel. Well, you know the story. As the church record of Northampton has it, one single sentence: the Reverend Jonathan Edwards dismissed. Here he is, the most popular pastor, probably not only in the colonies, but even in old England, and he gets kicked out of his church at Northampton. He gets all kinds of offers. He gets offered to go to Scotland and pastor churches. He gets offered to Boston. There's a group within Northampton that do not agree with the decision, and they offer to start a church right there in the town and appoint him pastor. But he takes up a post 40 miles to the west to be the minister at what was a mission outreach in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. For 7 years, Jonathan Edwards, pastor, theologian, ends his life briefly as the president of Princeton for a few short weeks. But you can also say missionary. For 7 years, Edwards was a missionary among the Stockbridge Indians. One of these Indians that Edwards baptized, and yes, this was an infant, so I'll let you get over the trauma of that, was a man by the name of Hendrik Alpamut. Alpamut went on to be a captain in the Revolutionary War. A legend has it that he came across a British garrison and single-handedly defeated them all. After that, he was appointed chief of the Mohicans. He led the Mohicans as they were kicked out of Stockbridge and first to Albany, New York, and then they made their way west, where they eventually ended up in Wisconsin. He would go on to translate the Westminster Shorter Catechism into the Mohican language. It's one of the few Mohican texts that we actually have. There's a letter from Hendrik Alpamut to Edward's son Timothy, who stayed in Stockbridge and was a merchant. And he sent this letter to Timothy, and he asked him for a couple copies of his father's books. And he asked especially for a copy of Freedom of the Will. This is probably the most difficult text of Edwards to slog through. And this Mohican Indian chief wanted a copy of Freedom of the Will. And also, if you could be so kind as to oblige me and send a copy of Religious Affections. Hendrik Alpamut was the inspiration for James Fenimore Cooper's literary character, Hawkeye, the last of the Mohicans. That man, the real man in real life, was baptized by Jonathan Edwards, and from a distance had that impact of Edwards upon his life. This was Edwards as a missionary. But I mentioned this book, The Life of David Brainerd. And the interesting thing about that book is that that book continues to pop up in the history of missions. It was read by the Wesley brothers, and they made it one of the 50 books. They had a training regiment for pastors in the Methodist Church, or people of the Methodist way, as it was first called. And among those 50 books that these pastors had to read, 2 of them were by Edwards: Religious Affections and The Life of David Brainerd. Now, Wesley edited both of them, and he edited a lot of the Calvinism out. So I would not recommend that you read Wesley's versions of Jonathan Edwards. Let the hearer understand. But think of the impact those books had. But then they had an impact on this man who really is the apex of this story of missions. Indeed a Baptist, and this is William Carey. In 1792, influenced by 2 things. As a boy, reading the voyages of Captain Cook and realizing that there was a world out there beside his quaint little English village. And then reading, more substantively, the life of David Brainerd. And realizing what an urgency it is, what an importance it is to proclaim the gospel. So in 1792, Carey writes his book. I want to read the entire title to you. An Inquiry into the Obligations of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathen, into which the religious state of the different nations of the world, the success of former undertakings, and the practicability of further undertakings are considered. The title was almost as long as the book. The book was only 87 pages. But it was 87 pages that changed the world. It was launching the modern missions movement. Carey was born in 1761. Initially, he was apprenticed to a shoemaker, and that was going to be his profession, a shoemaker. One of his fellow apprentices loved the writings of the Puritans and introduced William Carey to some Puritan books. That led Carey to first become a Baptist lay minister, and then that led Carey to become a Baptist minister. Then it led him to be an author of this book in 1792, and then a year later, William Carey became a missionary. 1793, Carey, with his wife and newborn infant, set sail for India. The first 7 years of Carey's missionary work in India was absolutely horrific. They get there, the partners immediately depart and abscond with significant amounts of the funds that they were sent there with. And then they turned on Carey and accused him. And so he's having to vindicate himself to the sending society back in London that had sent him. His infant son dies, and his wife, prone to depression and showing indicators of what would come to be mental illness, upon the passing of her son, slipped into the throes and was captive by a mental illness. And Carey was met with absolutely no converts in his 7 years. Ruth Tucker talks about how the first 7 years of Carey's mission work, he's in one room learning Sanskrit and attempting to translate the New Testament into Sanskrit. Meanwhile, his wife is in the next room, screaming most of the day, and he's alone. His first wife dies, and he moves to Serampore in 1800. And there in 1800, he has his first convert. And he baptizes him in the river, this Hindu who now is a Christian. Carey's met by a printer, by another pastor, the Serampore Trio, they're called. And Carey sets to work on his printing press. Over the next 34 years, Carey will produce Bibles in 8 languages, whole New Testaments in 8 languages, and portions of the New Testament in 27 other dialects. He will establish college. He will establish hospital. He will actually even be part of the Horticultural Society of India and promote crop rotation and irrigation and these kind of things to help what he saw as a resource-rich country, yet suffering in the throes of poverty. This was the life of Carey. He once called himself a plodder. As Carey said, "I am a plodder. I will persevere in a definite pursuit." And that's what Carey did. In 1812, there was a fire at the Serampore mission. It destroyed the printing press. It destroyed all of the copies that he was working on, and it destroyed all of the typeface and all of the translation work. Now, this is not just simply, it's on the cloud somewhere and he can recover it. It's gone. It's gone. Decades of work gone. And this is what Carey says: "I submit to his sovereign will." I don't know how one can be a missionary if one is not a Calvinist and understand the sovereignty of God. You see it in the life of William Carey. On his gravestone, Carey requested that a line from one of his favorite Watts hymns would be etched, and that's all it says: "A wretched, poor, and helpless worm, on thy kind arms I fall." This life of William Carey and this book that he wrote and his work there at Serampore all gives him this place as the father of modern missions, the founder of the modern missions movement. And when you look at what comes in the 1800s, you see the establishment of the missionary societies and the great missionaries themselves. It was the century of Adoniram Judson, David Livingstone, Hudson Taylor, Amy Carmichael. It was the century of the student volunteer movement, started here on the campus of Yale University with its president, Timothy Dwight, grandson of Jonathan Edwards. Dwight got to Yale and estimated that fewer than 5% of the students at Yale were converted. So he started doing 2 things. During the week, he started debating the faculty on the inerrancy of Scripture because none of them believed in it. And he was their president. And then he started preaching in chapel on Fridays, and he preached the gospel, and he preached the gospel, and he preached the gospel. And that spread to Andover, Newton, and that revival spread all through New England. It began the student volunteer mission movement, which was the beginning of America's entry into, up until recently, dominating the scene of filling the globe with missionaries. Well, all of this stems from these sketches from church history. One of the things that you realize is that all of these were pastors. Luther, Calvin, John Eliot, Jonathan Edwards, William Carey, all of these were pastors. Called to be pastors who recognized the need to take the gospel beyond the walls of their congregation and to proclaim the gospel to the world. You know, one of the things that I find is almost discouraging when we study church history, and I make my living off of church history, so I shouldn't admit this, but I think sometimes we get discouraged because we begin to think, who am I compared to these great figures of church history? And we see their great accomplishments, and it can have a negative, unintended consequence of causing us to think, yes, but I'm not so gifted as they to be able to do this. It's at times like that that I think we need to hear words from Paul. So I want to end briefly with looking at a text from Paul. It's 2 Corinthians 4:7. You know this verse. But, Paul says, we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. It's just a few chapters earlier at the end of chapter 2 where Paul says, as he's talking there about the aroma, the gospel is an aroma of life to life and death to death. And it's as if Paul, here, saying these words and writing these words, needs to take a step back. And he takes a step back and he says, who is sufficient for these things? We are jars of clay, aren't we? We have our limitations. I was running the other week with my daughter, my 12-year-old daughter. I thought, oh, this is great. I hope my neighbors are watching this father-daughter moment. She's running along, and I'm all euphoric, and what a great moment I'm spending with my daughter. And all of a sudden, she blurts out, we might as well be walking. I never needed these till recently. But far more than our limitations, we're all aware of our sinfulness, aren't we? Our selfishness. Why is it that we can be so forgiving of our faults and so quick to fixate on the faults of those around us? We know what it means to be a jar of clay. And we know our utter insufficiency, whether it's our limitation or our sinfulness. And then we know this task, don't we? What does Paul say? We have this treasure, this gospel, and God in his wisdom has entrusted the spread of the gospel through human instruments. And we have this treasure. We know the importance and the urgency of this task. And what an inverse relationship, isn't it? The priority and the beauty and the excellency and the glory of the task and our utter insufficiency for it. But there is us, there is the task, and then, thank God, there is God. And so as we think about this, we are reminded of our great God, aren't we? Paul's reading the psalmist, not to us, non nobis domine, not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to your name be glory. We are insufficient for these things. You read about Jonathan Edwards, William Carey, Martin Luther, do feel inadequate because they felt inadequate. We must sense our insufficiency so that we recognize our sufficiency, infinite sufficiency in our great God. Our God who is infinite in power. Our God who is infinite in knowledge and wisdom, in love and grace and mercy. This is our God who has called us to this task, and he knows our insufficiency. He is well aware of our insufficiency and knows that in our willingness to serve him and to be faithful in this task, wherever God has put you to be faithful in this task of proclaiming the gospel to the nations, that the surpassing greatness and power of God will be demonstrated in your weakness and in your insufficiency. And so may you trust in that